G'day friends, Malloy here. Today we are talking about everything related to tanking. I've got Sape here with me who will be leading this discussion, and I'm super excited to learn about this and all the different classes in tanking and how everybody needs to be working together. Thanks, Sape. Over to you.
Hello. So, this is going to be part one of two classes, essentially on the essentials of tanking, essentially on the essentials. And this one's going to cover the more basic, or at least fundamental elements. Part two, we'll get into more nuanced details, but there still will be quite a bit of detailed information here, especially whenever I get to the point of addressing the various strengths and weaknesses of each of the four primary tanking classes and how they have to synergize whenever you have multiple tanks in a raid, and how people need to adjust their play styles accordingly, like all roles to the tank and or the tank or tanks that they have, and understand that you can't play the same way with Brawler tank as you can the Guardian, and especially healers really need to understand the differences between them. So first, I'm going to start with the basics. Your build. It's a little bit more complicated, and you have more options than most other roles, and essentially, your first priority is getting your mitigations, both of them, up to a level where you optimize them. In the stat video that we uploaded last week, I go into some detail on this, but really quickly I'll cover it here. And this goes for, there are technically 6 tanking classes, one of them being Warden, which uses medium armor. But for today's purposes, I'm not going to touch on Warden. The others all are heavy armor, and the maximum mitigation that they can reach, as far as the hard number goes, is 150k in order to mitigate 60% of damage. And that only applies to landscape and tier 1. Whenever you are doing tier 2 content, then it's 165k, and tier 3, 180k. And whenever you are making your build, you need to factor in that beasts, especially, as well as just stat food, provide a significant amount of mitigations, a few thousand. And then the mitigation scrolls that you can buy from the store, really cheap, not on sale. You can get 25 of them for 195 LP. They last 6 hours and they give another 4,200. You can buy both Fizz and Tagnet. You can also spend Destiny points and those benefits, but that's pretty expensive. I prefer to go with the LI, or the Store Hop rather. And I'm just going to, before I get into other stats that are important, cover what you need to understand about the value of mitigations whenever you're a tank. The closer that you get to 100% mitigation, each individual increase in percentage has more value than the prior, especially for you, because you are reaching the highest levels of mitigations. You should be using traceries, and if you could pull up your LIs fast. Should be using traceries that include both, like she has 2 grand willpower and 2 grand armor. And so not only do those give tactical and physical mitigation themselves respectively, but having 2 of them will give 1.5% additional of both types. And that stacks on top of, for instance, you can see on her belt that she's got incoming damage reduction, or she actually does not have you should have okay, yeah, minus 3% incoming tactical damage and minus 3% incoming physical damage. Well, that's not exactly mitigation stacking. It doesn't, but it applies to once your mitigations have already been established, your mitigation percentage, and it applies mathematically to that figure. However, you're probably going to have traits that increase mitigations further, and for instance, most tanks sit between 65 and 70% base mitigations, 62.5 on both of those. But you also have various skills that will increase those percentages on most tanking classes. And gear pieces, step bonuses, etc. So say that you're just at 62.5% and you go with, like, you're trying to choose, for instance, which gold pocket to craft. The 3% plus 3% morale one may look enticing, but the value of the heavy token is a lot higher, because even though plus 1% mitigation may not seem like much, whenever you have, say, 70% just on average, and you go from 70 to 71%, that does not mean that you're going to be taking 1% less damage. It means that it's a lot closer to 3% less damage. And so it's significant to understand that the percentage it increases to mitigation on top of hard cap figures are critical to just reducing your incoming damage, obviously. After that, there are 2 priorities: morale and avoidance. Avoidance meaning block, parry, evade, and the partials of those. And before I get into those, it's worth noting that if you don't have appropriate finesse levels for the content that you're going into, that all, if you have really low finesse levels, your attacks will be blocked, parried, and evaded, and you will not be able to generate the same amount of threat, as well as apply the effects that your skills do onto the enemies. And so you need to, for all tanking classes excluding Brawler, have the same finesse levels if you want to completely avoid resistance, as I recommend for DPS. Like 65k for tier 1 in landscape, 75k for tier 2, 85k for tier 3. And that's not complete no resist, aren't complete no resist figures, but they're sufficient enough, especially with raid buffs and whatnot. This is actually, this table that you're showing now is actually from before there were only 3 tiers of content. So the finesse figures are now higher. That was back when there were 5 tiers, and current tier 3 figures are actually slightly higher than the old tier 5 figures. But the mitigations over there on the right definitely apply, and that's not counting Snowbot mid-tomes, but it is accounting for having Minstrel using Anthem of Composure, and that's not something that I recommend that tanks rely on, because a lot of the time you will only have one Minstrel in the group, and you will it will take them a while to get to Anthem of Composure as a priority. And so if you want from the beginning of every fight to have max mitigations, I don't recommend relying on the roughly 7k with the tracery that Anthem provides. But if you're really short on stats, and I mean, it's an option. So you also have to take into account that if you have a captain in the group, IDOM in Defense of Middle Earth provides more stats that equal up to over 1,000 more mitigation as well. So really unbuffed, like the safe figures are roughly 169k of both if you're using Storm Mid-tomes and Scrolls, Feast, and IDOM, counting on, because IDOM you don't have to be in combat to establish it like you do with Anthem of Composure. Okay, so Finesse, though, yeah, that chart is obsolete as far as the figures go there. But the ones that I listed before are sufficient. You might want to push them a little bit higher if you are concerned with aggro at all. But that goes for all tanking classes excluding Brawler. Basically, Brawler needs less finesse than other classes on both specs because it literally has no tactical abilities. It's all physical, and tactical abilities require a higher amount of finesse to avoid being resisted, whereas you don't need as much to avoid being blocked, parried, and evaded. And why Brawler is able to get, especially Blue, is able to get such low finesse, like 40k is actually even slightly more than I probably need for tier 3. But just to be safe, got it there. It's because of this trait called Retaliatory Precision. When you parry, you get a finesse buff, and it is very, very significant. Lasts 30 seconds, and I believe that it's 36k. Just gonna verify. Okay, see, I parried, and no, 32.4k more. So my finesse hops up to a little bit higher than I need to ensure that it's at 73k now. And I could drop that a little bit, but I never want to be blocked, parried, or evaded at all in tier 3 content, because Brawler struggles with aggro, especially in AoE situations, and that's something that I'll get into more detail about in the next class. It'll be published a week following this one, where I cover Blue Brawler in detail. But for the other tanks, you need to stack finesse to appropriate levels, or you're going to struggle with aggro, and also the effects that you apply, your abilities to enemies, are going to not always work. So after you have the appropriate finesse levels, you definitely want to focus on prioritizing morale or I should say avoidance, meaning block, parry, and evade. And this varies from class to class, situation to situation as to what's most important. For the majority of fights, all um, all the damage, or most of the damage at least, can be blocked, parried, and evaded. There are a few where the major damage sources cannot, and in those cases, you want to ideally have a swappy, what's called swappy gear. So, like, I'll just pull up an example of. Here I've got. I don't actually have supplemental vitality on my brawler. I don't find it's necessary. Um, but I have a whole bunch of essences and can slot them in. Anyway, pretend that like I'm wearing legs right now with physical mitigation, and I've got a swappy with tactical mitigation, and one with evade for like lower tier content where I don't need such high mitigations. And I wanted to push my avoidance up even higher. Um, Evade is the most important for well, majority, at least, of tanking classes. The most valuable of the avoidances to stack. Not only because you don't need to be facing the enemy in order to evade like you do with block and parry, but because evade has the highest rate of the increase of its partial evade chance, as well as um, the amount of damage reduced when partially evading, and also has the steepest or the least steep, I should say, a slope of diminishing returns as it approaches its cap. So stacking evade is very important, but for instance, as I mentioned before with Brawler, in order to reach appropriate finesse levels, you need to be parried, or you need to get a parry. So that's why I have a few parry essences. Let me find one slotted. Um, but mostly evade. Yeah, there's one. I've got enough parry to where 9.3% chance of a parry happening, and that's enough in general, especially in AoE fights, to where I don't have to worry about my finesse levels. Um, but for most tanks, actually, you get a whole lot of block and parry from having a shield. So excluding Brawler and Bear, you're wearing a shield, and not only do you get more block and parry from that, but your class also provides you with more block and parry from traits as well as your primary stats. So in general, you're just gonna want to stack evade as much as possible once you reach mitigation and finesse levels. Um, if you know that you're going into a fight where the major sources of damage or all the damage cannot be block, parry, or evaded, then you want to push morale as high as possible. Brawler has such high morale, and I'm not currently tanking any content that can't be blocked, parried, or evaded that's significant. So I don't have those swappies made, but if I am going to be going into it, I will, make them. Anyway, um, crit defense is your next most valuable stat. though it is not something that should be prioritized over any of the others. Um, Incoming healing, very valuable as well. Still, don't sacrifice the other stats for those. And resistance is somewhat valuable as well, but it goes in that order in general. Crit defense does not decrease your chances of being critted, it decreases the amount of damage that crits do to you, um, but not by as much as you would think. Um, it's not like because it's reducing the magnitude of crits, which have a higher base multiplier. Um, so it's not as much of a reduction as you would think just by looking at the percentages listed on the character window. And it's worth noting here that one of the reasons that avoidance is so important is that before a hit a hit's chance to crit or to devastate is calculated, first the chance of it being blocked, parried, evaded, partially blocked, parried, evaded, uh, and resisted are all calculated. And if any of those uh, if are rolled, essentially, like uh, imagine that there are dice that are being rolled, and so you add up. I've got 3% chance to be fully and partially blocked, and roughly 14% to be parried, and then a total of 25 to be to evade, partially evade. So 25, 14, and so roughly 32% chance to for one of those, assuming that I'm facing my target, that it will kick in, and not only will obviously if I fully block parry or evade avoid all of the damage, but even if I partially do, then that's calculated before the chance of being critted is. And obviously, if any of those occur, then you can't be critted. Same thing with if you resist on an effect. But in a lot of fights, and this is why resistance is overrated or not understood as well as it should be. In a lot of boss fights, the most dangerous effects that are applied to you ignore your resistance. So resistance is really not nearly as valuable of a tanking stat as you would think. Um, Incoming healing is significant, but you shouldn't have to rely on it nearly as much the um, as the other stats, because primarily the majority of heals in this game, especially your self heals, are morale percentage based, and incoming healing does not increase the majority of them. There are a few exceptions, and that also applies to heals from other sources as well. So that's basically the priority of stats. As far as traceries go, because Brawler has like no sources of crit defense, just naturally, um, almost. Um, I'm using Word of Craft defense, as well as 2 Grand Armor and 2 Heraldry of the Stalwart Ox, um, in order to never have to slot any mitigation essences, ideally, or at least very few, because I get extra tactical mitigation from this trait. And could reverse that, but I prefer it this way in general. So, your allies bring them back up or slot. Um, and really, you just need to assess how many, just what fight you're going into, and how many targets your AoE attacks hit, as well as if you're going to need that extra target count in order to hold everything, or if it's even going to be your job to gather everything. For instance, Guardians have Bastion of Light and War Chant that hits everything and large radiuses around them, and so um, while they still may want area of effect target count for instance, Vexing Blow and um, Whirling Sweep, um, or what is the name again? It's escaping me. Um, Whirling Attack and other AoE attacks that generate threat. It's not quite as valuable to them because they've got abilities that generate massive amounts of threat to all enemies in a certain radius. Um, so, moving on from that, morale, you primarily want to get from your virtues. Like, you want to get as much morale as possible from your virtues. And um, because, especially if you're on a tanking class that doesn't have a huge amount of morale just naturally, um, like champions and brawlers have a whole lot more than guardians and captains, for instance. So loyalty, fortitude, and honor. Honor is actually your most valuable one because giving maximum morale, tactical mitigation, and crit defense, as well as the passive bonus of more morale, is your top virtue. And then there's a fidelity, which also gives um, roughly half the amount of total morale as the others do. And then compassion gives the most total mitigations as well. You can also swap out mercy or more evade if you train it up. And then justice, which also gives more morale and some tactical mitigation, are arguably good swappies. And then if you really need to push finesse, wit can be valuable, but the crit and mastery that you also get from it makes it's kind of almost like if you don't have if you only have 4 good tanking virtues, and wit is at least more useful than you know an a DPS related one. Um, but yeah, in general, these 5 are what you want to go with, because the morale bonuses are just so significant from virtues, especially whenever you apply things like motivate, the buff, as well as hope token, 5% morale scroll, um, and then base morale multiplier, tracery. Um, those figures actually you actually get like from just loyalty, honor, fortitude, and fidelity alone, you get somewhere in the vicinity of 50,000 um, morale. Um, and with the passives, it's more like 55. So that's a very significant source of morale. And if you find pieces that you can that give morale as well, and they're pretty rare in gear, but as well as vitality, then those are incredibly valuable if the rest of the stats aren't outweighed by better gear that you have. So after yeah, virtues and obviously your word of your word of masteries vary from class to class, but in general, the most valuable secondary stats on them are going to be vitality, and well, mitigations, and then vitality, and then the evade, block, parry, followed by once again crit defense, incoming healing, and resistance. And also, you shouldn't neglect, especially your primary stat. So might, because it gives mitigations as well as you avoidance stats in addition, um, and outgoing healing, which actually increases your self heals more than incoming healing does. So I guess the next thing that I'm going to transition to is aggro establishment, threat establishment, and what perceived threat um, actually is. It's it's largely misunderstood, and um, your taunt timing is very critical, as well as your the skills that you utilize to build and to maintain threat in different situations. You need to situationally, based on the fight that you're going into and the group composition that you have, um, time your taunts to copy the amount of perceived threat of the highest group member, which should either be yourself if you are able to get in a few big hits initially, or if you have enough taunts to where, for instance, Guardian can just utilize Fray the Edge, and single taunt, uh, hold something on cooldown just consistently. Um, but in general, you don't want to open up with your taunts. You want to delay them until enough aggro has been established to where you can use them and have a forced attack effect applied. And uh, for most tanking classes, most taunts, that only lasts 5 seconds for all of their taunts. But Brawler's AoE taunt, for instance, Come At Me, lasts 10 seconds, and also it causes increased threat over time. Whereas the single target one, um, it only lasts 5 seconds and also increases threat over time. But while you're being force attacked, and I believe this is across the board, you like the skills that you use to generate threat, um, generate more threat during that duration than if you don't have a forced attack effect applied on the target or targets. So you want to, while you're holding them, and they can't be pulled off you unless someone else force attacks over you, um, and taunts over you essentially. You want to use your biggest threat building skills, like knee strike, for instance, for Brawler, for Guardian, vexing blow, for AoE especially, um, for Captain. Lindell's nope. Captain has a little bit different of a situation with threat. They don't have much trouble with it at all, and I'll get to that shortly. And then neither does, in most situations, Bjorning. Um, you just need to understand that while Guardian and Captain can, once they grab something, pretty much hold it the whole time, um, that you still need to allow, especially captains, to get into melee range and to use their skills so that they don't have to blow their AoE taunt, which is 40 meters, but it it has a relatively long cooldown, so they don't have to blow it at the beginning. You want to delay opening up with ranged DPS, especially with brawlers, uh, to a lesser extent, but still significantly with Bjornings and with captains until they get into melee range, and with guardians until at least they have, in AoE situations that is, at least they have a few skills um, established so that, Bastion of Light, War Chant, um, down at the very least. Um, and then if you're going to build, if you're going to just, you don't want to open up as a DPS and pull threat at the very beginning. In general, in groups, you want to all coordinate to uh, stack your buffs and debuffs on the enemy, your self buffs, your group buffs, and as well as establish your damage over time effects, and then use your, you know, the big OFIs and etc. skills, and then everyone at that point, unleash your big damage. And by that point, um, the tanks should have and be able to hold aggro, especially if they're chaining their taunts appropriately. And Keep in mind as a DPS class that at least the ones that do the most burst and pull the most frequently are generally ranged. And Red Lore Master, Red Hunter, to some degree Red RK, and Red Minstrel. There is almost there is no reason, unless the mechanics of a fight demand it, for you to not be stacked with the group close to the tank. Um, Period. In this game, you should just always be stacked with the group for so many different reasons. For like, if you have a brawler tank, for instance, I'm just going to use tank buffs here as an example. Like brawler tank, the buffs that it applies are incredibly potent, especially offensively, but they only apply if you're within 15 meters of them. And so if you're standing, you know, outside of the group as ranged, you're not going to get those buffs, and you're not going to get the captain's self heal or the captain's group heals that also have a a limited radius. For instance, Mariner, you need to be within 4 meters of them to get the crit chance buff. That's pretty significant from Dramatic Flourish, one of their skills. It's just a very, very good idea to always be close. And so I understand that a lot of DPS think that um, if they do pull aggro, then they have a greater chance of surviving if they're out of range. If they're out of not out of range, but if they're far away from the target. Um, but that is not usually the case. You have, if you are playing one of those classes that pulls most easily, then you have very potent perceived threat drop skills. Beneath Notice for Hunter, Major Call for um, Red Lore Master, and then you also have, you should have some self-defensive skills that are to where you shouldn't have to worry so much about needing to give the the tank time to taunt back before something reaches you. Try to stay grouped up, especially whenever you're playing with Brawler, Captain, Bjorning tanks. Because if our taunts are on cooldown, and for instance, the Brawler only has 2 taunts, and one of them has a base of 29-second cooldown, the AoE one. So if you're a red lore master and you use Nature's Fury from 20-30 meters away, and you pull multiple mobs, I've got to, as a brawler, run over and hit them with my AoE abilities, hoping that they're not on cooldown, and hoping that that's going to work to pull them back. Especially if my single target taunt's on cooldown, I can only use that, and then this skill that I don't know why it's not on my bars right now, but I can hurl objects, and that may pull something back, but it's not a taunt. However, if you're in melee range, then I'll be able to utilize all of my without having to turn, for instance, all of the mobs that I am still holding that you didn't pull off, like my primary target, turn them toward the group and potentially get the group frontals or whatever. So if you're right there and whatever you pull turns around and hits you, if the tank does not have a cooldown, then uh, you should try to decrease your perceived threat. You should, in most cases, stop using big damage skills, um, especially if you don't know the tank very well, if you're in a pug or whatever. Um, but if you're going to use sacrifice, um, and um, but in general, uh, that's more of a yellow Bjorning skill that's regularly used. Um, anyway, so more group utility. If you're the only Bjorning in the group, you provide significant debuffs that also increase group damage to the enemies. Not nearly as much as Brawler, but still very significant. If there's another Bjorning in the group, though, especially a red one, then you're not, like, you can't really overlap too many of them. You can chain Armor Crush, like you can alternate it and keep it up its incoming damage debuff to 10%. It's 10% incoming damage on the target, but it has a cooldown of 20 seconds. And so, I mean, that's about the only one. The others, like you can't layer them. It's 12? Okay. Yeah, you can't layer them. So if there's another, you only really want one Bjorning, but you always want one Bjorning in, especially raids, but in groups in general. So where captains really shine is, and this also somewhat applies to Bjornings, is captains have such potent self heals as well as group heals, and increase the healing ability of their shield brother, so which they almost always put on the healer. Like they can just keep themselves alive a whole lot more easily, and be kept alive and keep the group alive, than other tanking classes. They're the go-to for group defensive. Bjorning it doesn't have the same amount of group offensive and healing um, as Captain, but it does have significant self heals, especially in AoE situations. Brawler has significant self heals in single target situations um, with the appropriate raid gear set bonuses. But as well as um, aggro, like, and this is why you see way more of them than the others. Uh, Class for tanks is Guardian, even though it has, in many ways, not the least utility. That would be Champion, but out of the tanking classes, the least group utility, but it has less than the others. However, it has so many potent self um, cooldowns, defensive and heals, and has so many ways of always maintaining aggro in all situations, as well as um, just a variety of uh, very short cooldown, very potent skills that can be chained, and they don't need nearly as many heals in most situations as other tanking classes, with the possible exception of Captain in certain situations. And Bjorning on Trash, for instance, um, because Bjorning self heals really shine whenever they're attacking a whole lot of enemies. Um, and just to wrap up the group utility, uh, the 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 defensive utility skills that each one has, as I already mentioned, Captain has the most group healing by quite a bit, and it also has, in harm's way, as I mentioned, to be able to, in times of emergency, um, take the group's damage upon itself, and then, but it doesn't really have that much offensive utility for the group. Doesn't contribute much to group DPS, and um, it doesn't provide like decreased incoming damage to the group nearly as well as like Brawler, for instance, has one of the best cooldowns in the game for raid-wide defense, which I'll just demonstrate here. One for all. Um, if you have a group of 6 or 12 people, then for, once again, only within 15-meter range, radius rather, of you, this is supply, so another reason to stack. But for 30 seconds, it decreases the incoming damage of everyone down to 80%. So, like, that's almost as powerful as warding knowledge, which only lasts 20 seconds, for instance. Uh, it's basically a less powerful version of the Blue Mariner 6 set raid gear, Guided with the Stars. It lasts about the same duration, but it's not quite as potent. It's 80% rather than 70% damage taken. And there are other benefits to Guided by the Stars that it doesn't have, but still, it's a very, very strong defensive skill as well for the group. And Bjorning has, I was actually planning on bringing mine up and checking, but we're running short on time here. So really quickly, remind me, because I don't actually play blue spec, Bjorn, remind me what the group defensive skill is and how much it does. The like decreased incoming damage.
Oh, there's not really a group defensive. All you've got is single target sacrifice that applies to all.
So there's not I thought there was one that hmm, okay, yeah, this is one of the reasons why it's best to, in raid situations especially, have a guardian combined with a captain, or guardian combined with a brawler, and to have, as I mentioned, you want a Bjorning in the group, but because of the amount of debuffs that they provide in all specs that increase especially group DPS, but it's best to have that on a red Bjorning or even yellow, because you also want brawler buffs. However, with brawler, for instance, uh, basically all of the buffs that the red spec has, the blue spec also has. So that's one of the reasons why, like, I am a firm believer in, for the vast majority of fights, at least, bringing, for raids, bringing a Guardian and Brawler combo. Um, Guardian and Captain can sometimes be better depending on strategy and the fight that you're going into. Um, and there's one more thing that I want to mention about group utility. Captain, um, in general, you're always going to have a red captain in a raid as well as a yellow captain. If you bring them together, then you can put up on the target both telling mark and revealing mark, and so basically every 5 seconds, as long as for everyone who is hitting the target, that has revealing markup, by which the yellow captain can establish, they will heal. Is it 2 or 4% in yellow? Um,
On yellow is 3%.
3. Okay, yeah, 3% every 5 second of their morale, just passively, which for some fights can make an enormous difference. Um, and you also have your own group heals, um, which is kind of unique. Like other tanking classes don't really heal the group very much, if at all. So I'm gonna wrap it up there. In session 2, we'll be covering more of tank synergy, as well as and how to best accommodate playstyle um, according to who your tanks are, and especially for how healers need to adjust to the class that their tank or tanks are, by knowing the cooldowns and the strengths and weaknesses and etc., which we'll get into in a bit more detail in part 2. But yep, that's it for now. Thanks
Yep.
for tuning in.
Thank you everyone so much for watching, and as Saip said, next time we'll have an even further description on this. Thanks everyone for watching. See you next time.